Welcome to episode 3 of the Speed Secrets podcast with today's guest, Kevin York. We'll talk high performance and race driving and give you some tips and advice that you can use to improve your own driving.
Welcome to the Speed Secrets podcast. Join Ross Bentley and guests, drivers, instructors and coaches, engineers, officials, and others for conversations about high performance and race driving. Listen for tips and advice, thought-provoking ideas, and inspiration to take your own driving to the next level. Green, green, green!
Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today's guest is Kevin York. Kevin is one of those guys that's been around in the sport for a long time. 25 years or so, Kevin, I think.
That would be right.
Yeah, in many different roles, but mostly as a driver and a coach. Kevin, you've raced in Continental Tire Series, you've club raced for years, I know, been an instructor for just about everybody in different performance driving schools, and you were one of my Speed Secrets coaches years ago, so been around that world for a long time. I should also mention that Kevin's kind of a guy that I count on as my research assistant, or actually, what I should say, I guess, is my lead researcher, because it seems like every few weeks I get an email from Kevin with some really, really interesting link to something that relates to driving. Maybe not always in an obvious way. A couple of weeks ago, you sent me a link to a podcast interview with somebody that records sounds in nature. And I'm not going to go into the details here, how that relates to driving fast, but it does. And that might even turn into an article for Speed Secrets Weekly. So we'll talk a little bit about that kind of stuff and how we kind of get off into different things. But first of all, just welcome to the show, Kevin. Really glad to have you here.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Ross. It's always a pleasure to chat, and it's nice to have some other folks included in our chat now.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So, and obviously you and I, we could talk all day long about high performance and race driving, but I want to focus a little bit on what's going on in the driver's mind. You have a degree in psychology, is that right?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess let me ask you that. How does that education, how does your background, how has that impacted the way you've coached drivers?
Well, I mean, not to be too obvious, but, I tend to be a driver that is literally more thoughtful, I think. But that's not something that I've become gradually. I was that way from the very beginning. I realized that there was a whole process to driving that was beyond just the hands and the feet. And frankly, part of me in doing my undergraduate psychology work was motivated by, my interest in driving. And I don't know, it's hard to disseminate and pull it apart because that's how I've always felt about driving. And I know that you had some training early on, and that's how we actually were connected initially, was through that whole mental and sort of psychological aspect of driving.
It's interesting how many people in motorsport, they went to school, and the reason they went to school was simply to help them in their motorsport world. They either got a degree in business or marketing to help them on the sponsorship side of going racing, or the psychology side of it, or something like that. Or so maybe that's a good thing.
Indeed.
Yeah. And having been a thoughtful driver, I guess, is that something that you were before you even found motorsport? Or, have you always been a thoughtful person and that's what kind of led you there? Or was it that you found that helped you? Which came first?
Specific to racing, I don't know that I'm necessarily what I would call a natural talent or even a seat of the pants driver, but I knew that I had a desire to drive a race car. And so being that I, if we'll use that word again, perceived myself to be a thoughtful person, I figured, well, I better use the tools that I do have and try and dive into what makes a good driver and what makes a great driver and try and figure that out. And, a lot of that was sort of thoughtful training, whether it's as simple as visualizing myself as that type of driver in the future, or if it was working through the actual driving and visualizing a track. I mean, there's various levels of that sort of mental aspect to things. And it continues to help me in many ways be a better driver than if I just didn't simply quote, think about it. And I just tried to physically act. As I said, I don't think my talent level is sufficient enough to just act on those things alone. I've got to consider the whole piece of the puzzle, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And actually, it kind of triggers a thought here, and it's a question that I've asked many times is, does coaching and the thoughtful part of coaching, does that get in the way of you being a fast driver? Or does it help you?
That is a very difficult question. I continue to ask myself that in my own self-coaching. I think sometimes it does. And you have to be, as a driver, if you're self-analyzing, you do have to sort of turn that off sometimes and just work on what you've already sort of practiced up to a given moment. And then if you're going to execute, let's say you actually are going to be qualifying or racing or doing a lapping session, you just simply have to turn off the quote thoughtful part and proceed. But that presumes good training and good thoughtfulness up to that point, and then just act upon all those things you've done. And that's a long way to say, I think, what a lot of people, you have to fill up a lot of good practice time and then just go execute, pull the trigger, if you will.
Yeah, I think there was a period in my racing career where, as a race driver, I think one of the biggest challenges of being a professional race car driver is that you compete for your job with other people who are willing to pay to do your job. I don't know of any other profession in the world that's like that. So it's a difficult thing. So, along the way, trying to make a living as a race car driver, I'm also teaching and all that kind of stuff, and which is something that I enjoyed and have as much passion for as the driving part. But I found myself that I felt that I was slow. It was slowing me down. And it was exactly as you talked about is I think that I overthought. I would get in the car and I'd overanalyze things, and I'd be, thinking about all the little details that I'd been teaching other people. And then I got to a point in my career where I could just turn it off. And I think some drivers reach that point, some drivers don't reach that point. And I think the very, very best drivers have that ability to be analytical up to a certain point and then turn it off. And as I always say, drive stupid.
Correct. And exactly. We have our own ways of saying that, but my version of, I think, the same thing is I have to turn off my imagination, or my thoughtfulness, if we'll use that word again, and just sort of act. But you're right. There is a moment where you can be filling yourself with too many sort of detail analysis, and you've already filled that up ahead of time, or at least if you've done your training with a coach or yourself correctly. And then it's just time to, as we've said, execute it. There are, I think, at least in my experience, there's lots of pushback, from drivers when you start to have a conversation about the mental component to driving and the psychological aspects and this thoughtfulness or mindfulness or however you want to describe it. And I think some people are afraid that they'll fill their mind with too many thoughts, and not be able to then drive efficiently and well and quickly because they're thinking too much. And on some level, I think that's true. But in terms of practicing and leading up to events where you want to have high levels of performance, you have to look at all the small details, many of which are involved in the whole mental aspect of driving.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of, great examples of some of the greatest race car drivers, the ones that win the most championships have that ability to be very analytical up to a certain point and then turn it off and just drive. And it's actually harder, I think, to see that in Formula One because we kind of look at Formula One as just drive on the ragged edge the whole time. But still, I think, if you look at, if you looked at the championships that Michael Schumacher won, yes, he was very aggressive. Yes, he was. He drove on the ragged edge, but there was a very thoughtful part of what he did as well. And I think, that made a difference between him and a lot of other drivers. You look at NASCAR, you look at Jimmie Johnson. I think he's a perfect example of a driver who has the ability to be very analytical up to a certain point, and then just turn that off and drive the frickin' wheels off the car. And
right. Exactly.
See it in a Scott Dixon in Indy cars, and you look at every top driver, and then you look at some other drivers who, they win every now and then, and they're either too analytical or they're too not thoughtful.
Correct. I agree with that 100%. There are a lot of drivers that I think in my description would have that sort of innate ability, that natural ability, but not understand the whys but have an occasional moment of success and maybe even sometimes lots of success because they've gotten lucky in a given moment. But in terms of a winning machine, and you gave two great examples, which are almost cut from the same cloth, and Michael Schumacher and Jimmie Johnson, in terms of I think their approach, whether it's the team or the car or their preparation of their body, all of those aspects are very similar between those two drivers in my understanding. And look at the results,
I think they both won 7 championships, haven't they?
To my point.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You also mentioned turning off your imagination. That's an interesting thought. Explain that.
Well, it's always been a joke between my oldest son and I that when we started driving together indoor racing cars, I always joked when he said that he was faster than me, which was often the case, that it was not so much his weight, which was less at the time. It was more a function of his, he had less imagination than I did. In other words, the older I got, the more I knew, the more I considered, the more I had, frankly, difficulty turning things off in a thoughtful manner. When you don't have those thoughts, you have this different clarity and this different approach to just going fast because you don't think about the consequences, because sometimes you don't even know what the consequences are. And I found that in his case, he's continued to be able to turn that imagination off because he's still faster than me in many cases.
Well, and I think that's the thing about being young is you're naive, right? You don't know.
Correct.
You don't know what you don't know, and
Correct.
that's why. So I guess you could look at Verstappen in Formula One this past year, and I think
example.
There's another example. I mean, that rain race at which was the wet race? I can't remember. Brazil, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where he did things that he wasn't supposed to do. Well, he didn't know he wasn't supposed to do them, so he just went and did them.
Right.
Yeah. So having that ability to use your experience, but then still just go back and turn that off at times. That's what makes champions, I think. So.
Correct. I mean, if I might, I have, transitioned a little bit in some of my wheeled sport, and I'm now racing mountain bikes.
Right.
And what I have found at the very bottom of my learning curve is where I find myself relative to racing and riding mountain bikes, because I'm fairly new to the sport. And I have lots of imagination as an older guy, and lots of thought about the consequences of either falling off the bike or hitting a rock or hitting a tree or crashing in a stream or whatever the case might be, because the idea is to pedal as quickly as you can through the woods, right? And especially in a competitive event. But the more that I try to apply some of the things that I've used in motorsport, whether it's training of my body or training of my mind and understanding the sport, I've gotten better at being able to then have a bigger, let's say, cup of knowledge, but then I don't have to necessarily fill up that cup when I'm racing as much as I would have, say, a year ago even, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you've gone from 4 wheels to 2. You're going to do
a little bit.
You're going to go to unicycles later?
No, but I have a friend that does have one.
Really?
So I might try one. I'm not so sure that that's for me, but the mountain biking has been a pretty interesting transitional sport for me a little bit as I've stepped away from four-wheeled sport a bit in terms of doing it myself. And it's been fun to apply the same concepts that frankly you and I have talked about for a long time and see how they work in the woods on 2 tiny little knobby tires.
Yeah. And I guess that leads me to the question of why the heck do we do what we do? I talk about this. I had kind of one of those moments a little over a year ago at Sebring. I was coaching and I'm just standing at the fence watching my drivers go through a particular corner, and all these cars kept coming around and around and around, and I kept going, why are you doing this? And I guess over the past year or so, I've been thinking more and more about just that why question. And I don't know if you've got some thoughts on why the heck do we do this? What is it that makes us continue to drive around to racetracks? And it doesn't matter whether we're racing wheel to wheel or we've gone to our first driving school, or we're doing track
Hmm.
days or whatever. I mean, we keep coming back for more.
I've answered that question or forms of that question in many times over the years, and I think I'll try by way of explanation. I first started sort of as a car enthusiast, and then that transitioned into understanding that people race cars, and so then I became sort of a spectator of motorsport, and then I realized, well, I would like to do that, and so I transitioned from someone who just wanted to look at the sport to actually do the sport, and it became less about the car and more about the activity. If you can follow, there's a shade difference there. For me, it was four-wheeled. I like to hold the round thing and push the little black things with my feet at that time, and still.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a case of having mastery over a given thing, and the given thing for me and for us, for this audience, is an automobile or a racing vehicle of some sort. Because I've even found myself in Class 8 trucks at one point, trying to think I might race one of those, or go-karts, or whatever it might be. But four wheels, four contact patches, steering wheel, pedals, but mastery of that and sort of going through the process of that. Now, there is a component of that car enthusiast that still hangs in there. I like the sound of the engine. I like the idea of being on a flowy racetrack that has hills and turns and different cambers and whatnot. But I think we could draw it out to any sport, whether it's kayaking or climbing or what have you. If somebody likes to master that which they're drawn to, and in our case, it's motorsport, it's racing cars or motorsporting vehicles. So that hanging on the fence, I've done that many times too. You're watching your own client, your person you're coaching, and you're watching the other cars, but watching them learn each lap, watching them come through whatever corner you're watching in a different fashion. That's cool. I mean, you see these little, I call them mini epiphanies. You see these little moments of learning and mastery and changing and understanding things differently and doing worse or doing better. It's that process that's really cool.
But what about the people that don't care about learning? And I guess I've noticed that over the past few years, when I'm talking to people about, some training program I'm doing or something like that, and they have no interest in it, and yet they still go to the track.
Right.
And so I get, to me, it is all about the learning and the mastery. It's can I do that little thing? Can I do that better?
Right.
But there are people that, maybe they do want to get better, but maybe they don't want to admit that they want to get better. I don't know.
Right.
Like, I sometimes wonder about that as well.
I think I've encountered, I think, the very same personalities. I mean, there are some people that, the fun way to think about it is they just want to go fast, the Ricky Bobbies of the world. And those are one and dones. They come in and they might do a track day, or they might come to a manufacturer driving event and that's based at a racetrack and enjoy the cars and get a little bit of sprinkle of learning, but they really I don't care for that. But I think some people don't know what they don't know, to use a word or phrase you used earlier. And once they get an understanding that there is a depth and a breadth to anything, in our case, racing and motorsport, they get a little bit more intrigued, and then they become maybe the person that goes to a second or a third track day and get connected with a good coach or an instructor and realize, ooh, there's a lot here, and I do actually like to learn. I've encountered many of those people too, where they had no understanding of motorsport or cars, but they ended up at an event because a friend brought them, and then suddenly a whole world was open to them. And I've got good memories of many people that are, now happily, deeply, way wedged in the sport because of brief moments like that they never would have thought otherwise.
Yeah, there are so many people that I've talked to that they're like, I got into the sport and thought it would be easy, and then I found out how much is involved with this. And
Exactly.
you just start thinking about how many different things do you do in one lap? How many different techniques, how many different little skills that do you use in one lap, and trying to put all those together. And I think about that and go, you can go and you can drive around and around and around, and somebody else could hop into your car, or that exact same car, or you could hop into somebody else's, and you could go and drive around and around and around, and you're like 4/10 of a second difference. And I ask people, count to 4/10 of a second, and it's mind boggling. This past year, I went to the Nürburgring. 14 something point something miles around this circuit, 100 and whatever it is, 60 or 70 or 80 corners, something like that. And I went out to do 2 laps to collect some video and data so we could show to some of the other drivers. And I go in and hop in this car, and I go out and turn 2 laps, and I come back in, and I don't have thousands a lap at the ring like some people do. I had, at that point, I had less than 2 dozen laps, but I came back in and had 2 pretty quick laps, and we look at the lap time, and they were 4/10 of a second difference.
Wow.
Over a almost 9-minute lap or something like that. And you're going,
right.
How is that possible that you can go and drive 14 something miles, do all these different things, and come back in and be 4/10 of a second different? It's kind of mind boggling to put that into perspective. And
it is.
Yeah. When you look at the drivers that you've either raced against, that you've done track days around, that you've coached, you've instructed as, new drivers coming into different programs, what are some of the things that you see that kind of separate the best from the rest, I guess?
Well, if we set aside the outliers that have just natural ability and just look at what I would call the average driver, people that come and experience track days or let's just say racers, let's use club racers, I guess, as a good example. People that take the time to consider their own driving. And for me, what's always been a key finding is those that make notes. I mean, I don't know if it's an actual notation or just an observation that they might be making like a scribble on a piece of paper, or many people I wish actually carried notebooks. And I know you and I feel similarly about this, but almost to a person, the ones that I have witnessed that do already, without me having to provoke them, make some notes, typically have a different approach to their driving. And so I don't know if that truly answers your question, but that's one aspect that I've seen many times, people that seem more curious, I guess. And one of the curiosities that they have is that they're making notes. They're considering things. They're trying to remember things in a way. And there's a whole host of literature that talks about how different learning styles, and we could go off on a tangent on, how different people learn and what they do. But I think that there is validity, no matter your learning style, to jotting things down or making a doodle of something that you found important in an area of the track, for example, or whatever.
So it sounds like it kind of goes back to that being thoughtful.
Correct. And maybe it's just because I'm sort of bent in that way myself, so I'm more alert to that in other people. But that's something that I certainly key into. Another thing that I find interesting, not related to that at all, is I like to take rides away from the track when I'm coaching someone. I like to be in the car as a passenger and just have, a regular conversation with no necessarily agenda that's understood by my client or the driver I'm working with. But I like to observe how they drive their car in the natural environment, let's call it, outside the track. And speaking of notes, I will make notes, probably mental, because I don't want to be scribbling next to them while they're driving. But then outside that moment later, I will take some of those observations I would have made and talk to them about it. Because I do find correlations from street driving to track driving, probably in a way that most people wouldn't think. Some people think racetrack to car on the street, but I take street driving to racetrack.
Yeah.
And whether it's their understanding of their surroundings, whether it's their hand placement when they're unconsciously driving or subconsciously driving, they're just not thinking about what they're doing. I just want to see their natural sort of approach to it. And I find so much information out from just riding with a person on the street that is hugely beneficial to them in a race car. I don't know how you feel about that.
It's part of my coaching plan.
Well,
it,
maybe that's where I got it.
yeah, it's part of if I can, I will arrange that, if I'm going to coach somebody, either hey, pick me up at the airport, or something like this, and we driving in the rental car and you're having conversation, and you're just you're noticing the way the driver releases the brake pedal, applies the brake pedal, like you said, the hand position.
Exactly.
You kind of even look at, you will notice where their eyes are tracking, how much they're moving their head, all of these kind of physical things that you can kind of pick up. And it's those habits, those mental programs.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're kind of distracted by I'm only driving on the street and we're having a conversation, so I'm not even thinking, well, that's where all these habits come out.
Exactly.
And you know that either when they get on the track, they either have to consciously think about changing them, or those things are going to creep into their track driving as well.
Correct. I mean, the way I look at that, I think I'm saying the same thing in a different way, is they revert to their quote base programming.
Yeah.
And when they're not trying to drive fast, is when their natural state comes out. Well, that you and I, as people that are trying to elevate performance of others, we want their natural state to be higher than it was, right? And hopefully higher than the rest of their competitors. So the result then would hopefully follow that they are better than the rest at the end of the race. But if their natural base sort of program is such that they're going to, not pay attention, release the pedals abruptly, not hold the steering wheel correctly, or turn it incorrectly or too abruptly, or whatever it is that we're measuring or observing, then, we got a lot of work to do. But if they're, mindful, and they're looking around, and they're being delicate with their inputs, and they're, being considerate of the environment, and driving the car in an appropriate way, or what we define it as appropriate anyway, then we've got less work to do at the track, I think.
Oh, so I think we've let out our secret. Hopefully, there's not somebody listening here that's going to go, "Oh, I was going to have you coach me, but now I'm afraid that I'm driving a streetcar with you." So, yeah.
That is true. Maybe you should bleep that part.
Yeah. I think there's way more that people can do when they're driving on the street to actually help them become better drivers. And I think it's no different than, I know you do a lot of work with performance driving school, and somebody comes in off the street and they're doing their first school, or they're one of their first times at the track, and you see all those habits come out, and you just sit there and go, I mean, really, people show up and they look at you and go, "Oh, teach me how to drive fast," and you kind of go, well, deep down inside, all I'm going to do is try to break some bad habits.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Or in the case of new drivers, like teen drivers or newly licensed drivers, try and build good habits right from the outset.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Great point. And again, it kind of goes back to that. They don't know what they don't know yet. So hopefully you can
Correct.
mold them in the right way from the very beginning, which is, yeah, they're little sponges
Exactly.
at that point. That's great.
That's true.
Is there a physical technique, a physical skill? Somebody listening to the show can kind of go, "Oh, I never really thought about it that way," or the importance of it. Is there a physical skill or technique that you think that drivers should be focusing on more? And by the way, you can't say they should look farther ahead, because everybody
Right.
says that, and
So-
I believe that's still hugely important, but you can't use that one.
Got it. Not a technique per se, but something that, and it's sort of twofold, but there are two things that I key into, and I notice virtually in all drivers, which is why I guess over the years I've keyed into it, because I see it, and I personally find a correlation to being aware of these two things I'll mention, and then correcting them in a way that I think is beneficial. But that is what I call tension in the shoulders and holding your breath. And I think they're correlated. And invariably, I can either look at an in-car video if I've got a camera put on a driver so I can see their posture, or if it's a car that I can be in the car with them, and I look at the driver. Invariably, over the course of a lap or a session, as things start to get faster and more sort of heated, let's call it, I'll see their shoulders start to creep toward their earlobes. and that is correlated to, I believe, their tension. They're so, for lack of a better word, and it's, I think, incorrectly used here, but just sort of quoted, their focus, and they're so intent on driving, quote, fast, that their shoulders and upper body and upper neck tension just increases, rather than relax and just have an open body and sort of get, frankly, a breath out. Oftentimes they'll be holding their breath, and I know that you talk about that a lot, and as do I. And just not that we need to go into yogic breathing technique right now, but I do think that just the actual act of respirating at all is important. And so I have them drop their shoulders, open up their shoulders, relax their hands, and I tell them that I just simply want them to steer with their hands and their wrists and maybe their forearms, but leave the shoulders out of it and relax them and just breathe. And so those aren't techniques per se, but they're observations. And invariably they let people just, I think, perform instantly at a better level than they were before I made that comment or insight to them.
Yeah, I found that through my life, breathing actually helps. So I'm going to continue doing it for a while, I hope.
Well, we touched on me and this whole approach to mountain biking, and my nervousness as a newer rider. I would grip the handlebars very tightly, and I would find myself on a really gnarly part of the trail, rocky or a big descent or something, and holding my breath. And I'm like, why am I forgetting what I've already been knowing for decades and using in a car? I should use it on a bike. And instantly I would find myself relaxing and breathing and loosening my grip and moving my neck around, and it would be better. My performance would improve. So it seems pretty obvious, but people do need to be reminded of it, just like they need to be reminded of looking where they want to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So often it comes back to the basics.
Right. It's true. And I don't mean to be trite, but it's true. I mean, I'll have these conversations with drivers and they'll be all, of course, yes, I know. But then invariably, I mean, literally almost invariably, you'll get in a car with them and they don't perform the way they said they would perform because they don't realize it. So if we make them conscious of it and then they can correct it, then hopefully over time it becomes a subconscious or unconscious kind of behavior.
Yeah. It's so interesting how many drivers, they'll come along and they'll ask the question of, what are the, what does a Jimmie Johnson, Michael Schumacher, Scott Dixon, whatever, what do those guys do that separates them? And they're looking for that. Well, they use the brake pedal with their left kneecap and nobody else knows that, no, they just do all these basics. They breathe and they, do all and they look ahead and they do all those things. They just do them really, really well.
Correct.
So here's an interesting question for you is, what's the one question you get asked that you hate answering? It's like, boy, that's a dumb question. Stop asking me that question. And believe me, this will be the last time I ask you this, okay?
I think that I'm probably not alone in this, but how fast do you go is very often the question that I think a lot of race drivers get, and what's the fastest you've been, or some variation on the speed, because people are so romantically attached to the idea of speed and racing, which, let's admit it, that's part of the attraction. But for those of us that become more involved in the sport, realize that there's much more to it. But it is a very boring question to answer because it's not necessarily about the speed per se. It's the manipulation of the thing, like we talked about at the outset.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had as much fun driving a 20-mile-an-hour go-kart as I have had driving 150 miles an hour at Daytona. Frankly, probably more fun.
Yeah.
And it's a function of, what you're doing in the moment, in whatever vehicle it is you're with, and whatever competitors you happen to be with, or whatever it is you're working on if you're just simply driving laps by yourself and practicing something.
So let's flip that around. What's the one question you wish they'd ask you?
Wow. I'm not so sure I even have a good answer for that.
Okay. How about...
let me ask you, what's the question, that same thing? What question would you prefer they ask you?
What can you help me, how can you help me become a better driver? Or, hey, do you want to drive my race car? Or... Yeah, that's an obvious one. I was trying to be much more, high-minded. Yeah.
I'd love to have everyone ask me that.
Yeah. Okay, I guess that pretty much does it for the time. I mean, again, you and I could talk about this all day long, and we're going to come back. Sure. I'm going to have you back on the show again because I love talking to you, doing this, and it's fun sharing these ideas and thoughts and this conversation. So thanks for your perspective on all this stuff. Sort of before we go, what's what are you doing these days? How can people get a hold of you? What would you like people to know, I guess? And
Sure. So most of my work right now is done with original manufacturer driving training and events, primarily with BMW. So I'm often found a lot at the BMW Performance Center East, which is in South Carolina. BMW also have now a performance driving center on the West Coast. So that information is easily found on BMW USA's website under their Performance Driving School tabs. I'm pretty active on social media. Twitter is a good place. I'm at York Motorsport. Typically, I might indicate where I'm at on given events or what's upcoming. And, I'll throw in there my oldest son, Evan York, is doing a lot of work in those same venues. And I'm really proud of what he's done. He does a lot of team driving program with BMW, like me. He also works, as I do, on occasion with the brakes program, Doug Herbert's team driving program. That's be responsible and keep everyone safe. That's the brakes acronym. So those are two programs that are near and dear to me. And, as you well know, Ross, I do pretty much anything all the time. I've backed out a little bit, though, of one-on-one driver coaching just because I have other pieces of my life that require my attention right now as well.
Right. So, and I'll put a link to put your Twitter address or link on the show notes. And yeah, I know you're active on social media because often I'll post something and it's almost like, how many? Oh, there he is. Kevin's responded to it. So I love it. So, and with that, I guess, thanks, Kevin. I loved having you on the show. This has been fun and we'll do it again.
Great. Thank you so much, Ross.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Time for another quick speed secret. A short reminder that I hope will stick in your mind and be useful the next time you're on track. Here's today's tip. Just because a change doesn't work the first time, rethink and try it again. Alter your technique to make the increase in speed work. I see this all the time. A driver is told to try a different technique. For example, trail braking more into turn 1. And they go out and try it for a couple of laps and come back in and say, it doesn't work. Well, not many drivers can make a change and nail it within a couple of laps. Often it can take dozens of laps to get a change in technique to work. And to make it work, often you have to change other things. Sticking with our trail braking example, if you begin braking at the same place with the same amount of pressure but stay on the brakes longer, which is what you're doing with trail braking, for sure you'll be slower. If you're going to end your braking later, which is what you're doing with trail braking, then you'll also have to begin later. So just because a change doesn't work the first time, keep at it for a while to give yourself a chance to master it. If you'd like more tips, advice, and resources, check out my website at speedsecrets.com. And if you liked what you heard today, please subscribe to the Speed Secrets podcast. And even better, leave a review on iTunes. That would be huge and something I'd really appreciate. And once again, share with your friends. Hey, keep learning and having fun.